Hello, everyone. My name is Juanita Alvarez. I'm the Americas Regional Head for the World Green Building Council. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Urban Green Council for sharing this presentation and webinar with us today. As you know, the World Green Building Council is a global network of green building councils in almost 70 countries in the world. And we are collectively committed to reducing the building and construction sector's CO2 emissions to reach net zero by 2050, so that we can ultimately help limit the global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in that way, we are building a better future, and we're committed to green buildings for everyone, everywhere. As you may know, 1/3 of the world's energy goes to light, heat, and cool buildings. To avoid dangerous global climate change, we must significantly reduce this consumption by 2030. And building efficiency is not only a climate imperative, but is also a crucial piece of the full sustainable development puzzle that is worth an estimated of 26 trillion by 2050. However, the fragmentation of the building and construction sectors has made scaling best practices and innovation slower than in other industries. So partnerships and collaborations are therefore crucial to tapping the full carbon savings potential of a building. That is why with the Cities Climate Action Project supported by the Building Efficiency Accelerator that as World Green Building Council we launched last year, we're working to equip the Green Building Councils to deliver transformational change in building efficiency city policies and actions. Working with over 45 cities across the world with the BEA platform, we are supporting cities to develop codes, policies, and norms to promote energy efficiency in buildings. And this project creates a replicable framework through which the public, private, and NGO sectors can collaborate to deliver energy efficiency in buildings at scale. As part of this project, WorldGBC and Urban Green Council partnered to create a hub for the exchange of the world's best green building ideas. We aim to accelerate climate action in cities, and we are starting with this joint webinar. So now I'm going to ask you all to please have your microphones on mute while we have the presentation from our speakers. And also, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please write them in the chat box and we will answer them at the end. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and thank you to the Urban Green team for sharing all of this information with us. And now I hand it to you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Russell Unger. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Urban Green Council. One of the things you can see from the first slide of our presentation is we're trying to shake things up for a typical webinar, and we're going to actually make you do a little bit of work. So we've asked you a couple questions that we're going to refer back to in the presentation. There's going to be one at the end as well. But to start off with, love to kind of see who's on, where everyone's from. How do we get to that Slido?
So if you log into slido.com, it'll ask you for a code, and the code is UGC. Enter that, and then there's options to list where you're from.
All right, so as I mentioned, I'm Russell Unger with Urban Green Council. On today's presentation, I'll be joined by Chris Halfnight, who's Associate Director of Policy at Urban Green. Together, we worked on the 80 by 50 Buildings Partnership and the Blueprint for Efficiency, which we're going to be talking about today. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to turn things over to John Mandyke, the CEO of Urban Green Council, for a little bit of background about Urban Green.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our global audience. We're thrilled to have this webinar with the World Green Building Council. Urban Green is a nonprofit environmental organization. We are a green building council. Our mission is to transform buildings for a sustainable future in New York City and around the world. We view New York City as a fabulous laboratory for innovative urban policy that we can perfect in New York and export around the world, and today is a great example of that. I just want to congratulate World Green Building Council for the fantastic work it's doing, and also congratulate my friend Christina Gamboa, who is the new CEO, and thank Juanita for all of her work that she's doing in the Americas region. I've been active in the World Green Building Council since the beginning, and the work has never been greater than it is today, and it's never been more important than it is today. And we're thrilled to be a new partner at Urban Green with the World Green Building Council, kicking off with today's series. So I hope you find the information helpful and provocative for your needs in your country. And with that, I think we're ready to get started.
Okay, great. Thank you, John, for the intro there. So, quick results of the poll that you guys filled out. As you can see, we're mostly a North American crowd, but we have folks from the rest of the Americas and Europe. And normally in New York, when we ask people where they're from, we're expecting they're going to say Queens or the Bronx. We're not going to expect South America. So this is fun and different and exciting for us. So to ground our discussion, I just want to spend a couple minutes about the relationship between buildings and climate change in a city like New York. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, many people on this webinar will already know, but so bear with me. New York City is an island city. We're a series of islands. We're surrounded by water. We had a major storm a number of years ago that flooded critical piece of infrastructure and neighborhoods in New York. We have $3 trillion in real estate that's vulnerable to flooding. We have many people who don't have air conditioning in their homes that are vulnerable to heat waves. So we are the front lines of climate change, and we are seeing climate change around us. New York Harbor is a foot higher than it was about 100 years ago. And if that keeps rising, and when that keeps rising, we're going to face more and more threats. So climate change is not just a global threat, it's a threat to New York City. In New York City, given our really robust public transportation system, climate change is driven primarily by buildings. The fuels that we burn in the buildings and electricity we use there. The numbers are different if we were talking the US nationally. And about a decade ago, we started working on building policy in New York. We realized something quite dramatic when we looked at the data. What that told us is although there's 1 million buildings in New York, a very, very small number of them actually represented most of the square footage and most of the greenhouse gas emissions. And so just 2% of the buildings in New York, or about 16,000 properties, is about half the square footage of New York and about half the emissions. And these are the buildings over 50,000 square feet or 4,600 square meters. And then if you reduce that a little further to the buildings over 25,000 square feet, or 2,300 meters, that's almost 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions and energy used in New York City. So the things I'm going to be talking about in this presentation are all focused on these big buildings. One of the things that may be a little different about New York City than some of your jurisdictions is that things that we'll discuss were all laws or policies enacted by the city itself. We have the power to enact laws on anything that the state or the federal government hasn't already enacted laws or is somehow preventing us from doing so. So we have our own building code, our own energy code, consumer affairs provisions, we can create misdemeanors. So all these policies we can do here. I'm going to go back in time a little bit and just talk briefly about the almost decade that we spent in New York City really experimenting with the question of whether more information would drive market forces to make economic decisions that would drive energy efficiency. And those are encapsulated in a number of laws affecting these big buildings I've referenced. The first is a requirement that the big buildings measure their energy and water use every year. And the theory behind this was that would enable these owners to start comparing. They could compare their building to their neighbors. They could compare the building to other buildings in their portfolio. They could compare their building to itself in past years. And if their building is using more energy, they can start asking themselves, like, what's different about my building? Maybe see an opportunity to save money. And if they've done things and they are seeing savings, they can verify that stuff's working. The second law is one that requires these big buildings to do an audit and retrocommissioning every 10 years. And an audit is an assessment by a consultant of capital systems in a building. They go through and they identify opportunities to improve those and save money. And commissioning is retuning of buildings. It's like the same way you would retune a car. You go through, change fans, change belts, filters, check that valves are supposed to be open or open, those are supposed to be closed or closed. It's very customized to individual buildings. The primary concern when this law was passed was that there would not be enough professionals to do this work because it was highly specialized. And what we've seen over this almost decade was there was actually a flood in the market. So people entered the market to provide these services and at the level that owners wanted. And most owners wanted just to comply with the law. So we saw a commoditization of audits and commissioning service in New York. The average one is not as robust as it was before these laws came into effect. What we did get that's immensely valuable from these laws is a much deeper understanding of how energy is used in big buildings in New York City. And Urban Green analyzes this information every year in conjunction with the city. So for example, on the screen, you can see the estimate we have of energy use breakdowns in various building types in New York. And that has been immensely valuable as we've advanced policy in the city. And the final law I mentioned is a requirement for buildings to sub-meter their electricity uses in commercial tenant spaces and in common spaces and report the usage to the tenants, whether or not they're billed according to that energy, and a requirement for upgrades to lighting. And what you can see is that these laws, though, give owners until 2025 to kick in, so to comply, so it's a pretty long lead time there. These laws have been immensely popular across the United States. There's now about 20 jurisdictions that have some form of benchmarking. Others are doing things like audits and commissioning. And the question we asked ourselves, and many people were asking a couple of years back, is what did these add up to? And on first blush in New York City, we've seen significant reductions. We saw energy use down about 10% from 2010 to 2015, and greenhouse gas emissions down about 14%. But when you look under the hood, the situation is not quite as rosy as we might hope from an energy efficiency perspective. And that's because about half that reduction is because the power plants got more energy efficient and reduced less carbon, which meant our buildings were more efficient. And then of what's remained, another quarter of that was about fuel switching within the buildings. So they stopped burning oil and they switched to natural gas, which is cleaner. So only about a quarter of this reduction is due to energy efficiency measures. This led to kind of a widespread sense that we need to do more, that we're not on a pace to address climate change, that we need to be, and that culminated in an announcement by New York City Mayor in the fall of 2017 that New York City would enact some sort of mandate to reduce energy use in the large existing buildings. As I mentioned, there was a lot of agreement. We need to do something different. What there was not agreement about was what the structure of that meant, because there was going to be a big price tag to this. So who's going to pay for that? Is it going to be government? Are they going to subsidize it? Is it going to be the owners? Are owners going to just pass these costs on to tenants? That was a huge political question. And then we have, within these big buildings, we have extraordinarily important ones to the social functioning of the city. We have affordable housing, we have hospitals, we have schools, we have religious institutions. How would they fare under the system? And then we had a policy structure that was going to impact trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of people who work in these industries. How are we going to figure out all the details of that? So a lot of disagreement. Urban Green stepped into this challenge and brought together the city's building and energy stakeholders for something called the 80 by 50 Buildings Partnership. And we produced a report with recommendations on the policy structure called the Blueprint for Efficiency. And I can kind of jump to the conclusion and tell you this worked. we had all the stakeholders, all the major ones involved, endorsed our recommendations and endorsed this blueprint, and it was a major influencer on the law that was passed in New York. My colleague Chris is going to talk about the blueprint and the law, but before he starts on that, I'm going to take us on a sideways journey, and I'm going to talk about how we go about convening, how we got into this role, and what we consider to be the kind of key steps to effective convening. Urban Green is not new to convening. So going back in 2008 to 2010, we convened the New York City Green Codes Task Force. We did that at the request of the mayor and the leader of the city council. And our charge was to recommend improvements to the range of the city's codes that affect buildings so that we could advance green building. And then right after Superstorm Sandy, we were again tapped by the city and city council to lead the Building Resiliency Task Force and bring that together and make recommendations on how to ensure our buildings are more resilient. These were highly successful efforts. Collectively, we recommended about 150 new programs and policies, and about half of them were actually implemented as law or program. And since then, at this moment right now, we have a convening on advancing electrification of buildings, and we have a convening looking at how you do trading between buildings on carbon or energy efficiency. So this is an ongoing role for us. I've often been asked how we got into this game. How does an NGO start fulfilling the role that we've been filling as convener? There are a number of things that went into this. One of them is that we're dealing with areas of policy that are highly technical. So there's been a sense from government that they need more technical input than they have in-house. We have long-standing relationships with both sides of City Hall in New York, the legislature and the administration or the mayor's office. We work with the major stakeholders in New York on a range of policies, education, and research. So we have a lot of the relationships in place. As I mentioned, a couple times we've expressly been granted authority from the government to do this. And as each convening was successful and led to change, people started turning more and more to Urban Green to do convenings. I'm going to now walk through again some of the key steps we see to successful convenings. And the first is to have a reason for people who already have too many meetings and too many work hours in the day to sit in another meeting and to then substantively contribute. And everybody has been to meetings for meetings' sake. And so for people to come to our meetings, there has to be something on the line. And in this case, it was that there was going to be a new law. Everyone had the sense that a law was going to happen, it was going to be major, and they wanted to weigh in. So that was a reason to meet. The next question is, why would they answer our call to meet? And there can be a number of reasons for that. We might have an express grant of power. We didn't have that here. What we had was our credibility, our relationships, our track record of making change, and that's why people answered the call. But we have to have some reason that people would come to us. The art of convening, a lot of that comes down to who is involved in the process you put together. So what organizations, and picking the organizations involves a good read of local politics, and then knowing what individuals to tap. And at any given time at Urban Green, we have 100 to 300 people, professionals working pro bono on our various projects. So we have a very deep bench to choose from, and where we don't know people, we network to get there. So we're going to go to another one of these Slido questions, about who are the key influencers in your jurisdiction. So we can see kind of your answers are pretty similar to New York. So I'll give you building owners are the number one people responded to. And if this had been a year and a half ago, and we're talking about we meant political influencers, we would have given that as our top answer probably as well. But in New York, in terms of political influence, we're looking at unions, we're looking at tenant organizations, and we're looking, of course, at government and community organizations. The influence of owners in New York is not quite what it has been previously. The science of convening gets to the question of like how is using the structure so that people feel heard, they're listening to others, and they don't immediately jump to their positions. And so we use structure to break down barriers between individuals and organizations. We take the issue that's on the table, we turn that into a series of questions that need to be answered. Then we split the group into subgroups, which we ensure has diverse representation from the interests, and we appoint leaders. And then we actually require participants to not answer the question right away. Their charge is to come up with multiple potential answers and give pros and cons to that. And what that ensures is that everyone has been able to get their position out there, and everyone has heard other people's positions. Powerful people and organizations are not going to invest their time and reputation if they don't feel like they can meaningfully influence an outcome. And the only way to make that happen in a convening is to give up some control. And this is something that's very uncomfortable for governments to do because they have ultimate authority. Organizations like Urban Green, we can do that. And by still controlling agendas, by controlling who's brought in the first place, who's leading groups, mediating the meetings, being a moderator role, we still have a lot of influence in the process. But ultimately, we need to trust that we've brought in the right people, we've broken down the problem the right way, and they're going to get to a good, thoughtful answer that's probably the right answer, even if it's not what we would have arrived at the beginning. The flip side of that is everyone participating is a volunteer who's got a day job. And it is a massive effort to do convenings, at least the way we do them, with published report at the end. We feel it's really key that there be reference document, there be both a public-facing document and a more detailed reference document. And you can see from the numbers on this slide the huge amount of output that comes from these sorts of convenings. And even the best volunteer of the world will not be able to write beautifully, will not research all the things they need to do. And so as convener, we took a lot of that work on us. And the last step that we consider key is to recognize that most influencers are going to be lay, political influencers who are going to decide things, are going to be lay when it comes to buildings. And we're talking a legislator, a government official, and they are not going to look past an executive summary. So we spend a massive amount of time ensuring that that is a really engaging, readable document. We use graphics, we use images, and we obsess over our verbiage. So every recommendation, we've done this now multiple task forces, we have a 2-sentence description of the issue and a 2-sentence description of our recommendation. And years ago when we were doing the Green Coast Task Force, at the end of it, I was speaking to someone who was critical of a number of the recommendations, and he paid us a great compliment. And in frustration, he blurted out how there were a number of really dumb ideas in the report, but we made them all sound so good. And that was one of the keys to our success. I'm now going to turn things over to my colleague Chris, who's going to now talk about the building, the blueprint for efficiency.
Thank you, Russell. Hello, everybody. This is Chris Halfnight, Associate Director of Policy here at Urban Green. We've heard a lot about the process of the convening. I'm going to now transition us to the policy. I'm going to cover two basic things. The first is an overview of the blueprint for efficiency, which, as Russell said, is a report from the Buildings Partnership, was released in August 2018, and it was intended as consensus policy recommendations to shape New York City's future direction on an energy performance policy. Although it was aimed at New York City, the process, as Russell said, entailed looking at a lot of different options. So the outcome is really relevant to any jurisdiction that's considering this type of policy. And then the second piece I'm going to touch on is an overview of where the city ultimately landed on the policy when it passed a new groundbreaking law in April of 2019. So the blueprint itself is the product of 42 organizations, 70 experts, and 8 months of meetings, discussion, research, writing. It provides something of a how-to on building energy performance policy It has 21 high-level recommendations, very accessible, but it also has a technical appendix that delves into the key issues, the challenges, the potential solutions associated with this type of policy. And the structure of the blueprint is focused on 4 chapters. The first is create a smart framework. The second is adapt for special cases. The third is allowing flexibility, and the fourth, making efficiency easier. And I'm going to go through each of those. So create a smart framework is the section focused on questions of policy structure. A fundamental question of structure is which buildings to include. And in keeping with the policy history on energy and buildings in New York that Russell outlined, the discussion really focused on large buildings. And that's partly because large buildings have more square footage and more emissions from a fewer number of buildings. That means less regulatory burden. It also means easier administrative process. But it's also because large buildings typically have more advanced energy management, including energy benchmarking, audits, automated building management systems. They also have more money. They have an easier access to capital to finance building upgrades. And it's potentially easier politically. To be frank, large buildings are fewer voters, and at the municipal level, that can be a politically important aspect. It's very complicated to address small buildings at the city level, given the large number of voters that are affected. Perhaps the most challenging, complex, difficult question that we tackled with the group was how to measure building performance. And that is essentially a discussion of the metric, of how that metric relates to the requirements, and it's really the centerpiece of the building performance policy. So there were a number of key considerations that were central to the group's thinking. First, the complexity itself was rooted in the enormous variety in how and why buildings use energy. That's driven by factors like the building's features, but it's also driven by space use, occupant density, hours of operation if you're talking about a commercial property, and a whole host of other factors. And what they collectively mean is that energy use is not the same thing as energy waste. So higher quantity of energy use doesn't necessarily mean less efficiency or a lower efficiency building. We spent a lot of time discussing energy use intensity and the value of that metric. That's EUI. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's a raw intensity metric. It's energy use per square foot, so kBTU per square foot with no adjustment factors. And the conclusion was essentially that metric is just simply too blunt to account for that great variety of factors influencing energy use. The group also focused on the reality that less efficient buildings can generally realize greater savings at a lower cost, and so there's more opportunity to require deeper reductions. And then finally, that carbon is the ultimate goal of the policy here, and that's an important consideration when debating an energy metric versus a carbon metric, and site or building level energy versus source or energy that includes energy used at the power plant. So the group weighed many different paths based on different metrics. In very broad terms, those structures fell into 3 camps. The first is a percent reduction approach. That is a uniform percentage reduction applied to buildings across all sectors or in particular sectors. That's a typical approach in a lot of voluntary programs, some of the incentive programs that exist here in New York and elsewhere. And the advantage of that approach is that it meets buildings where they are. It inherently accounts for the unique aspects of their energy profile. The disadvantage is that it penalizes early adopters. It doesn't account for progress that they have made prior to the policy because it applies a uniform reduction across all buildings. Similarly, it doesn't apply greater reductions to poorer performers, so there may be savings left on the table. Second path the group considered was a hard cap or a single limit applicable to all buildings, and having all buildings need to reach that limit and get below it. The advantage there is, I think, on the one hand, a single standard has the virtue of clarity. It also squeezes more from those that are farther above the cap. So it requires greater reductions from potentially less efficient buildings. On the other hand, it's a one-size-fits-all approach. It doesn't account for those many factors that influence energy use. The third approach the group considered is really multiple approaches, and that's something of a hybrid, blending the features of these two different approaches. And there are a number of different ways you can do that, including taking a cap with an upper limit on the percent reduction required. Ultimately, where the group landed was a recommendation on combining an efficiency metric to sort buildings, and then applying a graduated percent reduction to those buildings where greater percent reductions are required of less efficient buildings. So realizing some of the advantages of both approaches. A third major question of the policy framework was how far, how fast, or how much should buildings reduce and by when? And here the guiding star was really something that is a stringency that is ambitious but achievable. And to put some detail on that, the group looked to existing retrofit programs, so what had actually been achieved in large-scale retrofit programs, and what was possible based on existing technology, and looking at energy modeling and projections of what's feasible in deep energy retrofits. With that in mind, the group defined essentially a maximum and minimum range that seemed feasible, and here that landed at around 20% source energy reduction. The timeline was, of course, also a critical issue, and the focus here was allowing sufficient time to make retrofits cost effective. And that means primarily allowing time for owners to align the work with the natural financing cycles, the points when equipment needs to be replaced, and when tenants are moving in and out of units. It also means allowing time to properly sequence and plan projects, and for such a massive industry transition, some time to adapt. And then lastly, the group was very focused on enabling a phased compliance timeline to avoid a scenario where you have 50,000 buildings in the case of New York, all seeking compliance in the year before the compliance year. So the second major chapter was focused on special cases. The aim here was really to ask which sectors need some form of unique treatment. So part of that is that some sectors need more help. Russell alluded to this, and we were focused in particular on affordable housing, mission-driven nonprofits, some of the other public interest sectors. And the reality is that they face particular financial constraints, regulatory constraints that make building upgrades more challenging, and also that there are potential affordability implications. So there need to be unique compliance paths and/or dedicated financing and technical assistance to make sure those sectors can achieve the reductions. On the flip side, government buildings have typically led on green building, and the group focused on ways for that to apply in the context of an energy performance policy as well. So here we're talking about deep energy retrofits at a scale that is really unproven, and so there's a need for some sort of proving ground to shine a light for industry, illuminate costs, risks, and solutions. So that meant requiring government buildings to go farther and/or faster, to do deeper reductions, potentially on a sooner timeline. The third chapter focuses on allowing flexibility. And the challenge of this section was really how to enable flexibility for owners and the market at large to unlock the lowest cost path to carbon savings. That is a policy good to reach the same end target, but in the most cost-effective manner. And the groups considered two principal means of achieving that end. The first is trading. So that means trading energy efficiency credits or carbon credits between buildings. So buildings with a higher cost of energy or carbon reduction can buy credits from a building with a lower cost. And then secondly, green power. So some flexibility to buy green power, likely in the form of renewable energy credits, that delivers environmental benefit and adds flexibility for owners, but requiring that that green power be local so that the benefits flow locally, the benefits of improved air quality, industry development, jobs, etc. And then our final chapter focuses on making efficiency easier. And the premise guiding this chapter is that the ambitious nature of our climate goals is really unprecedented. And so we are talking about an unprecedented scaling up of retrofits. And that requires an equal mobilization of support to help owners reach those goals. That means money in the form of incentives, loans, grants. It also means technical assistance to ensure they have the technical know-how and the resources to implement retrofits effectively. And lastly, in a standard part of the Urban Green Playbook, when we look to add regulatory burden or pass or influence new laws or policies, we also look for opportunities to lighten burden in ways that make sense, in smart ways. As many regulations get stale over time, they aren't updated for a decade or two. So the aim here is to find smart opportunities to revise existing regulations and thus free up resources and money that can then flow towards retrofits. So that's the blueprint in a nutshell. I'm now going to fast forward 8 or 9 months later to April 2019, and where after a legislative process, typical of a big complex piece of law, New York City passed a groundbreaking building emissions law. In New York, the law is called Local Law 97. It was part of what New York called the Climate Mobilization Act, which was a package of environmental laws all passed at the same time. It was also branded New York City's Green New Deal in a nod to the political moment that we're in. The centerpiece of the law is annual carbon limits that apply to most large buildings, starting in 2024, and then with a significant increase in stringency in 2030. The law includes flexible compliance options along the lines of what I previously discussed. And then, of course, there are large fines for failure to comply. So the law covers large buildings. That's buildings over 25,000 square feet. And in New York City, that makes up nearly 60% of the building area. So 60% of New York City's square footage is covered in one form or another under this law. And the biggest sector in that group is multifamily buildings. You can see that in the green at left in the box chart here. The emissions limits that are the centerpiece of the law are based on carbon intensity of whole building energy use. That's all the energy used in a building. So that is a raw carbon intensity metric. It's a measure of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per square foot. And the law sets 10 different intensity limits for 10 different building code occupancy groups. So it differentiates between different uses on the basis of building occupancy. That means that each building gets an emissions limit, an aggregate limit, or a greenhouse gas budget, a GHG budget, based on its square footage multiplied by the limits of its occupancy groups. And so a mixed-use building that has part residential and part commercial office would have a composite target or a composite GHG budget based on its square footage for each use multiplied by the appropriate limit. So zooming out to a kind of bird's eye view on the policy and where it meets buildings as they are, this is a schematic showing the distribution of building carbon intensity in New York City. It is a schematic, it's not actual data, but it looks very similar to both the multifamily and office curves in New York. And what you're looking at is on the lower axis, emissions per square foot, that's your raw carbon intensity. And on the left axis, number of properties, although that could be square footage, and the curve would look very similar. Moving from left to right, you're increasing carbon intensity. And you can see the bulk of buildings are lumped somewhere in the middle. So I want to flag 3 things on this chart for you. The first is the vertical line at right that says 2024 limit. That's roughly where the 2024 emissions limit is set, so that 20% of buildings Those to the right in red are above the limit and will need to take action to get below that limit. The second thing I want to point to is the 2030 limit, the vertical line at the left where the green meets the orange. You can see a significant increase in the stringency, or a drop down to a much lower carbon intensity, where about 25% of buildings are below the target, and accordingly 75% are above the target. The third thing I want to point you to in this graph is it's a very wide distribution. So there is a long distance for those buildings that are in the red or even the upper orange to travel to get down to the 2030 limit in particular. That's a function of having a hard cap. What it means is that buildings are going to need measures beyond just energy efficiency to get down to their emissions targets. So a few other key details of the law. One, affordable housing and a couple other sectors like houses of worship or building types received a different pathway, one based on low-cost energy savings measures, not emissions limits, given some of the concerns of those sectors I discussed before. City-owned buildings did in fact get an earlier, deeper, faster target. And hospitals got the option for a percent reduction framework given the intense energy use and the important public purpose of those institutions. So how will owners comply? We've grouped the compliance options into six numbers here. The first is reduce energy use. That's your typical energy efficiency or energy conservation. The second is reduce the carbon intensity of your energy, for example, by switching fuels. The third is buying renewable energy credits. That is part of the flexibility included in the law through alternate compliance paths. And the law actually allows up to 100% offset through green power credits.
Yeah, sorry.
But it must be local green power. And actually the geographic definition is very, very strictly local. So it has to be in New York City or directly feeding into New York City. The fourth is actually a couple different options grouped together, but there are a few offsets or deductions for carbon offsets. That's your more classic planting trees or credits for trees being planted, or clean distributed energy resources, things like energy storage. The details of those have yet to be specified and will be developed through rulemaking. 5, a compliance option we view as absolutely critical, given the structure of the law, is carbon trading or energy efficiency trading. The law does not include that as a compliance option, but it contemplates that coming in future with a requirement to study it and develop an implementation plan. And then lastly, there is of course the option of paying fines, which will sort of set a shadow price for some of the alternate compliance options. And I'll leave you with a snapshot of the timeline of this law just to give you a sense of what's coming over the decade ahead. And you can read this on the slide, but I'll flag 3 things. One is that carbon trading study that I mentioned is due in 2021. So if that's going to be an important piece of compliance, it should happen early, and the city is hopefully going to be moving on that quickly. Second, in 2023, rules are due, and a lot of the details have been left to be specified through rules on the advice of an advisory board and working groups that will include a lot of stakeholders. And so those details will be worked out over the next 2 or 3 years and come in rules. And then lastly, the first compliance report is due in May of 2025, and that's for the 2024 compliance year. So with that, we're going to turn to another Slido question. Having looked at the blueprint, broader view of an energy performance policy and some of the options, and then the specific iteration of that in New York City, can this work in your city? And we have, well, what I would characterize as a pretty resounding yes.
From 4 people.
From 4 people, okay. Oh, there's some more coming in.
It remains resounding.
So we're going to turn things over to questions. So actually, I think the first question is for you, Chris. Why don't you, since our audience is going to see it, we'll read them out and then answer them.
Sure. So we have a question about buildings with community solar. So the question is, how are emissions reductions calculated for buildings that host community solar systems, but then only consume a portion of the solar that is produced on that system, for example, on a rooftop? The answer to that question is basically TBD. So the law does contemplate something like community solar in the form of a distributed energy resource. It allows an emissions factor, so that's the multiplier that will convert energy used from that source into carbon emissions that you can then add into your GHG profile. It leaves the emissions factor for those sources to be determined by rule. There's also a provision for a deduction based on credits from those sources to be determined by rule. So it contemplates both being the host of that system and then also being an off-taker of that system and getting credit for it in some fashion. But the details will be specified in those rules that I mentioned are due in 2023.
Okay, so another question here was asking, what did we learn in passing the bill that would help other cities do the same? So I think that the answer to that is really dependent on your local jurisdiction. So there's kind of general rules around kind of engaging a legislature and engaging government, and kind of went through some of them. But probably the number one thing is, know your local politics, know your stakeholders, realize that the more you cover your bases, the more people who are involved, the more pissed if you forgot a really key constituency. So in our experience, always important is to bring people in as early as possible, create a sense of kind of co-ownership, and then by the time you get to the policy-making stage, if you've lined up a lot of support for stuff, that carries an enormous amount of weight in engaging the legislator and the government, and ultimate say on what's going to happen is going to be the legislature if it's passing the laws. They're going to decide what they're going to do, and they'll be influenced by your efforts if you do a really good job, but they're going to make the decisions at the end.
So another question we have is, how are building energy consumption or greenhouse gas emissions data collected and verified? That's a great question, and it's one that comes up always when we're talking about data, energy consumption, and regulatory requirements. So in New York City, the benchmarking laws that Russell reviewed earlier in the presentation have been in place for almost a decade, and building owners here have been submitting their energy use data through the EPA's, the federal level environmental protection agency here in the United States has a program called Portfolio Manager. Many of you may be familiar with it. It is an online benchmarking platform, and owners create accounts on that site and then submit their utility data through that site, and it goes direct to the city as part of their benchmarking submission. So there is a structure in place already. One big change in that very recently, within the last year, is automatic upload of that data direct from the utilities. So your electric and gas utilities directly upload your utility usage data to that platform and then direct to the city. So that's the primary vehicle envisioned for the transmission of data. That doesn't cover fuel oil on site, which is still done by pen and paper. So there's some questions around how that's going to be handled. And there are some wrinkles that have yet to be worked out because, of course, we're going beyond just benchmarking. We're talking about performance policy and stringent requirements. So one issue is the carbon multipliers, the greenhouse gas coefficients that I mentioned before, need to be applied to your energy data in order to convert it to a carbon profile for your building. The coefficients in the federal platform that's currently used aren't the same as all of the ones used in New York City. Some are, but a couple are not. So there's going to need to be some tailoring there. and it's not yet clear how that's going to happen. And then the second thing I would add is that there are hefty fines in the law for any fraud or data manipulation that are a step beyond what was in the benchmarking law, because we're moving from information disclosure to performance requirements.
So another one of the questions we see, this is Russell, is what aspects of the new law are exportable to global cities? So there's a couple elements that we see kind of right off the bat. So one of the most obvious ones, in fact, that we have a global initiative around is the idea of doing trading of energy efficiency or carbon between buildings. So we launched something called the Global Climate Efficiency Trading Initiative. So the idea there is that it's going to be much easier for some buildings to save energy or carbon than others. And so if they're given similar targets, a building that can save more could trade with one that is having trouble and can do less. And if you have a portfolio, you could trade within the portfolio, you could trade between private actors, and you could layer in important kind of social goals, like, for example, directing money to underprivileged parts of the cities with like a weighting factor. So if you are in certain neighborhoods, the reductions you do there are worth more. So that's like one that's quite exportable. As Chris mentioned, I mean, there was massive discussion about what the metrics should be used, like what is it that we're trying to reduce, how the standards should be applied. Those set of considerations, I think, are the same set of considerations that anyone looking at this problem would consider, and you may land on a different position, a different way than the city did, or that we did, which wasn't the same as the city. So that's another key one. What else? What would you add to that, Chris? About kind of key exportable items. Okay, those two are top of mind.
Sorry, I was focused on the next question I've got in mind here, which is a really interesting one. So someone has asked, are there any new rules regarding new construction going forward? And I'm going to expand that to how does this policy relate to new construction? So the first part of that is New York State and City are on the cusp of passing very aggressive stretch energy code. So a huge leap in the stringency of the energy code that governs new construction and the standards that it needs to meet. But the bigger context here related to Local Law 97 is, what does the law mean for buildings designing to that energy code? And the answer is essentially you need to comply with this law as a new building on day or year one of your operation, assuming if you're post 2024. So in effect, that means designers need to work towards the new energy code, but also the carbon emissions requirements that are in Local Law 97. So it's an extra layer, and I think the implications of that, the potential costs, the necessary steps have yet to be fully worked through.
So why don't we go, we can do this one, Joanna, this next question, Chris. So a couple of questions about compliance here. So a question is, where can we find the list of buildings that fall into the 20% highest emissions limit bucket requiring action by 2024? So right now, as far as I'm aware, there's not a list of those, but there are resources like one that Urban Green maintains called meter.nyc, where you can get a sense of it. So keep in mind that these are going to hit in 2024, so it's going to depend on the energy and carbon emissions of the building come 2024. We don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know for sure what those buildings will be. But if you go to meter.nyc, you can enter the address for a building and you can see how it's faring today, and that'll give you a sense of where it's likely to be in 2024. There's some you want to ask about compliance options?
Sure. We have a question about whether you can combine multiple compliance options, and the answer is yes. The law contemplates any of those compliance options that are available to you. One or two of them do have limits. I mentioned the 10% limit on greenhouse gas offsets, so you can't obviously go beyond that 10%, but it can be combined with the other compliance options. And then I guess the caveat that a lot of the details of some of those compliance paths have yet to be worked out and will be developed through rulemaking over the next 2 or 3 years on advice of the advisory board. So it's possible that issue will be revisited in some fashion.
So another question about can you explain a little bit about the experience and give us some tips on kind of how to start if there's already some green building legislation you're developing, but nothing as stringent? So this is Russell, back to me. So as I mentioned, I mean, there was a prehistory in New York. We had, some pretty ambitious laws already on the books. There was a strong sense across the city and political leaders that people were proud to be kind of considered leaders in this area, both in the public sector, from the legislator side, and in the private sector. So there was like a desire to do something, and so I think again this gets to kind of who are the key influencers and what's your kind of local political situation. But the way we got to this point was, many years of building up smaller measures, getting key information in place, expanding the kind of groups that were interested in buildings and energy. And so by the time it came to tackle something really ambitious, there was a lot of influential stakeholders willing to kind of lean into it.
Great, this is Chris again. We have a question about the idea of easing burden. I mentioned in the Make Efficiency Easier section that's kind of part of the standard urban green playbook, and can we give some examples of that to get an idea of how to identify opportunities in your communities? So first I'll say the blueprint dives deeper on this, so I would encourage you to go to our website, and you'll see on the blueprint page there is the technical appendix with 4 or 5 pages written on about 5 or 6 different ways that we tried to do this. And then just to give you a couple of examples, one, in New York City there is a facade upgrade law that requires repairs on a cycle, and it was safety focused, driven by some accidents related to facades in New York City a couple decades ago. We spent some time looking at facade laws in other cities and trying to identify opportunities both to potentially improve that law, because it's one of the most significant costs for building owners, and then also to look for opportunities to align energy efficiency upgrades with the time at which owners are doing facade repairs to make them less costly. And then another example is we looked at the heating season in New York City, which is from October 1st to May 31st. And that's the time period during which owners are required to maintain certain indoor temperatures. And we took a look at the climate data, and over the last 20 years, the temperature stayed above the minimum threshold for virtually all of the days in May. So owners were not actually required to heat, but were required to be ready to heat just in case. And so we formulated a recommendation on shortening that heating season by some portion, 2 weeks or a month, given it was not being used, to allow more time to upgrade boilers and improve efficiency of buildings. So that's just an example of the type of measure where there's smart opportunities to ease burden in a way that makes sense, and virtually nobody would oppose.
I think we're just about at time, so we want to kind of be respectful of everyone's calendar. So we didn't get to every question, but we really appreciate everyone who's listened in on this webinar, and thank you for your time, and thank the World Green Building Council for collaborating with us on this. And if you want more information about Local Law 97, we have a lot of resources on our website. It's actually right when you go to our website, urbangreencouncil.org, the banner at the top, you can click on it. We have a 2-page summary of the law. We have frequently asked questions. We have links to the law itself. And this was a pleasure.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Chris and Russell, and to all the Urban Green team for this great webinar and all of the information that you have provided to all of us. This webinar was also recorded, and we'll be happy to share with everyone the information. Thank you to all of you who joined and actively participated in the webinar with the questions. And if you need more information, you can see in the screen the emails that you can contact, also the resources that Russell and Chris shared, and you can reach out to WorldGBC as well if you need any further information. I hope this was of great use and inspiring for all of you, and thank you very much for joining.